Hi, my name's Mark Littlewood. I'm the Director-General at the Institute of Economic Affairs. This vidcast was from an IEA webinar, a whole series of webinars looking into the impact of coronavirus and what we should do about it. The topic of this webinar was, will coronavirus end the Union of the United Kingdom? Thank you very much for joining us. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Go to our website, iea.org.uk, and sign up for our daily newsletter and enjoy the webinar. Thanks very much. So let me introduce our guests. We have Angus McNeil, the Scottish National Party MP for h-Eileanan. Did I get that right? I've been practicing that for 24 hours. Was that a good English effort? I hope so.
That was very good. Yeah, clever.
Very good. Okay, good. Angus has been a Member of Parliament since 2005, currently serves as the chair of the International Trade Select Committee. We're also joined by Andrew Bowie, who's the Conservative MP for West Aberdeenshire and Kircardine. Did I manage to pronounce that right, Andrew?
Pronunciation perfect, Mark.
Excellent. Andrew is also a member of the IEA's Freer initiative. Prior to being elected in 2017, he's previously served in the Royal Navy, achieving the rank as sub-lieutenant. And since being elected, he's served as the PPS to two Secretaries of State for Culture, Media and Sport, and was the PPS to Prime Minister Theresa May. And finally, we're joined by Professor Philip Booth, Senior Academic Fellow here at the IEA and Professor of Finance and Public Policy and Ethics at St Mary's University, Twickenham. I was pretty confident I could pronounce St Mary's University, Twickenham correctly. Previously, Philip was, of course, the Academic and Research Director here at the IEA. And in 2015, he wrote an IEA book entitled Federal Britain, The Case for Decentralisation. And he notes that the UK is one of the most centralised governmental systems in the world and highlights some of the benefits of decentralisation or indeed going for a Federal Britain solution. I'm going to ask each of them to speak in turn, Andrew first, then Philip, then Angus, for just 2 or 3 minutes to set out your stall. And we've obviously, considering the future of the Union in the context of coronavirus, I've mentioned to the panelists before, it might be that you don't think COVID-19 will have any impact on the Union one way or another, or I guess it might be that you think it will impact the Union in a way that you don't want to happen. You might be a unionist and fear it will lead to independence, or you might be in favour of independence and fear it will lead to closer union. So don't feel obliged to only talk about what you think the impact of the pandemic would be. Give us your overview and prescription for a more efficient, better organised United Kingdom. Thank you to all of our panelists, Andrew, Philip and Angus, for joining us. Andrew, you're first to go. Your time starts now. Welcome.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, everybody at the IEA, for inviting me, Philip and Angus along to speak to you today. I think before we begin, we should probably take stock that we're having this debate at a time where 9,400 people are still in hospital across the UK suffering from coronavirus, and so many people are working very hard to ensure that the majority of the population are protected and we get through this current pandemic. So I think everything that we say should be couched and remember that we are still very much in the heat of this battle. That being said, turning to the question that you posed, could coronavirus end the Union? Well, I mean, I think you'd be very surprised if I said anything else, but no, I don't think it will end the Union. However, I actually don't think, in all honesty, that coronavirus will have any effect on the integrity of the United Kingdom whatsoever, positive or negative. And I think that's not saying I don't think that the economic case for independence has ever been weaker or the case for our union has ever been stronger. And that certainly, I think, has been proven by how we've fought the pandemic. But I just think that in Scotland right now, I think that Scotland is probably roughly divided into thirds. You've got a third of people who passionately believe in independence. You've got a third of people who passionately believe that we should maintain our membership of the United Kingdom. And I think roughly in the middle, you've got a third of people who remain undecided. And it doesn't really, I think, matter what happens, what approach we take, how we fight the pandemic, how we exit the lockdown. Those who support independence will continue to support independence, think that that is the best way forward. Those that continue to support a membership of the Union will continue to think that's the best way forward. And I think for the rough third of people in the middle, they aren't looking at this in terms of the constitution or how the United Kingdom constitutional setup is or may be in the future. I think the majority of people look at how we're fighting this virus, look at the two governments working for the most part together, understand that sometimes there does need to be divergence in how we approach this in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England, but don't really see that as being the matter of greatest importance right now. And so my view is I don't think that coronavirus will have an effect on the integrity of the Union. However, as I said, that isn't to say I don't think the case for independence has in fact ever been weaker.
Thank you, Andrew, and for keeping to time. Philip, let me go to you. We'll make sure in the chat that we include a link to Federal Britain, the book that you wrote a few years ago. You can download that for free from our website. And Philip, I've sort of described you as a federal unionist, I think, in terms of your description, but I'm sure you can put it much more eloquently to the attendees here. Philip, the floor's yours.
Well, I'm quite relaxed actually about Scottish independence, but I just felt Federal Britain was the right approach at the time. It's changed a little bit since Brexit because some of the arguments I used relied on the UK being a member of the European Union. And I felt that the United Kingdom government should have a really very small set of duties in relation to foreign policy, immigration, defence, and so on, and that everything else should be dealt with in the nations. What will COVID-19 have to do with all this debate? I don't think a great deal as far as the union is concerned, but I think it does shed a light on the issue of decentralisation of economic policy and decentralisation of political systems more generally. And interestingly, Nick Timothy, with whom I don't normally agree a great deal, said pretty much the same as I'm about to say in a newspaper article recently. Now, of course, the devolved nations do have the ability to act separately in this epidemic, and it's suggested that Scotland, Wales, and England doing things differently is somehow confusing. I think that's both insulting and ridiculous. People only either live in Scotland, England, or Wales, or Northern Ireland, and only one set of rules apply to each country. But not only should we have different policies within the UK, I think we should actually have much more regional experimentation and local experimentation in relation to policy. That's partly because circumstances are very different in different parts of the United Kingdom, population densities, the epidemiological development of the disease, demography, and so on. But it's also for a different, very important reason. We often think that scientific problems can be somehow analysed objectively, and as long as we look for long enough at the data, we come to the right answer. This is just not true, and recent experience, I think, has demonstrated it's not true. And when it comes to implementing policy, we have a pretty poor idea of what works. We've seen this in relation to the debate around schooling and quite a few other things. We need more experimentation in policy. We can't afford to take a risk with a one-size-fits-all policy which gets it wrong everywhere. We need to allow not just Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England to do different things, but other parts of the country to do so as well. Now, it's also, I think, COVID has shone a light on another aspect of devolution and decentralisation, which is it's all asymmetric and ad hoc. So the nations have spending powers, but not proper tax raising powers. When it comes to devolution within England, you have these agreements between big local bureaucracies, often much higher than local government level, and Westminster bureaucracies. And the whole process is not controlled by the people giving power to politicians. It's controlled by bureaucrats at the Westminster level and at other parts of the United Kingdom negotiating with each other. And again, you end up with a very unclear division of responsibilities. So we don't really know whether Andy Burnham is responsible for Manchester or not when it comes to policy in relation to COVID. So I think we should learn from Germany to cut it short. It's demonstrated, I think, the inadequacies of command and control and centralisation when it comes to healthcare. And I think it's also demonstrated that clear lines of responsibility when it comes to governance leads to more appropriate local variation in policy and better policy.
Philip, thank you, and for sticking to time as well. And last but by no means least, Angus, the floor is yours for your opening thoughts and remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you for the IEA too for holding the discussion this afternoon. I think it's always worthwhile to hear these views and to learn from one another. And I can also like to just say that I echo a lot of Andrew Bowie's sentiments there, that we are in the eye of the storm at the moment, or perhaps not quite in the eye of the storm, but there's still a storm raging with the coronavirus, and a lot of people are very busy and a lot of people are still in hospital. To the subject on at hand, I mean, I think the UK has been diverging since 2014 anyway, if not before. I mean, I think the sentiment that pushed the referendum on independence to 45%, almost half the Scottish people, a damning indictment really in the UK 6 years ago, that 45% of one of its nations wanted out and wanted away. And that has only grown in our direction. I mean, some of the polls are up about 52%. So this is happening anyway. It's something we see with the young people and as the demographics are shifting. And it's phase 2 of the disintegration of the UK. Ireland's already left. And Ireland going, there's nobody in Ireland, there's no political movement in Ireland, there's no navel gazing in Ireland today. So you might maybe uncharitably call this about should Ireland rejoin the United Kingdom. And in fact, the very idea would be laughed at, of course. I think to see Andrew Bowie smiling at the idea there. There is no chance that would come up in discussion at all. But coronavirus is probably underlining the movement that's happening anyway. We know the union isn't really wanted by the English either. They prefer Brexit's more important to them. It's a second or third order issue. It's the United Kingdom Union. And you know, they're very relaxed with Ireland having departed, and they don't want Ireland back, and they're happy to go on their holidays in Ireland, interact with Ireland and trade with Ireland. It's never been higher as a result of Ireland being independent. So when phase 2 happens, and when Scotland leaving, maybe there'll be a phase 3 and 4 with Wales and Cornwall. Who knows? But when phase 2 happens of the disintegration of the United Kingdom, it's only going to be a natural step. Coronavirus is showing the difference, perhaps, that we're having. And the fact, not even the changes of Boris Johnson striking an independent note for England, which I welcome, of course, and I'm a great fan of English independence. And I do believe that the English are every bit as good as the French and the Germans and can govern themselves without any help at all from the Scots. And I think that's a lesson that's maybe come from this episode, that the capabilities that really are latent, perhaps, within England, but I'm confident are there. They can do this. But I think coronavirus and the reaction to doing things differently shows just a nervousness that there is within sections of the UK, a nervousness that realising the inevitable, that it is going, and it's going for many of the reasons Philip laid out there. The unnecessary, overly centralised approach in the United Kingdom. I mean, I can't even get a few fishermen on fishing boats on the west coast of Scotland. The Home Office won't let them. They won't raise the pen to get a few people in, which would help our economy, and at the moment would help paying taxes and recovery. So there are decisions being made in London that are economically disadvantageous to Scotland, and they'll turn around and say that this is a function of Scotland. It's not. It's a function of being governed wrongly by the wrong place. And looking to Scandinavia, Iceland, which is part of Denmark, certainly wouldn't go back. Norway, the same, which is part of Denmark, and then laterally Sweden wouldn't go back. The Faroe Islands are just about independent. And the Faroes or Sweden are leading not just the Northern Hemisphere. The Faroes and Iceland are not just leading the Northern Hemisphere in the fight to coronavirus, but the world, in fact. I think the Faroe Islands were the first to be out of this, then followed by New Zealand, and probably then followed by Iceland. So we're seeing, whether it be New Zealand, whether it be Iceland, whether it be tiny Faroe Islands, that 4 million people do very well, and we can maybe stretch it to 5 million, and Scotland will do it anyway. What is happening in this coronavirus crisis? We have social distancing, and the next thing, as we're seeing, is the political distancing to phase 2 of the changing shape of the United Kingdom, to be a United Kingdom of England, Wales, and Cornwall, and maybe Northern Ireland. And good luck to them. We'll be good neighbours.
Angus, thank you very much. Let me start with a few questions to the panel. And a reminder, put your questions in the Q&A box. Somebody's put their question, I say, in the chat box. If you're able to cut and paste that and put it over into the Q&A box, that would be great. But I'm going to start by asking the panelists a few questions. Angus, I'll start with you.
Yeah.
At the time of devolution and the establishment of the Scottish Parliament, it seemed to be the theory of the then Labour government that this would kind of take the wind out of the sails of the SNP and independence. That sort of once the Scots were given their own parliament that could do some stuff, that the case for independence would weaken. But obviously we've seen electorally since then the rise of the SNP. I mean, in some spectacular election results, both at Holyrood level and at Westminster level. I mean, nearly sweeping the board Westminster level. I think that in 2015 we were down to 1 Liberal, 1 Conservative and 1 Labour MP north of the border. But what I want to press you on, and picking up Andrew's point, I don't know if you agree with his analysis of opinion that there's a sort of third of Scots very strongly in favour of independence, a third very strongly unionist and a third up to grabs. Do you think there is a constitutional settlement falling short of independence that would largely satisfy you and the Scottish nationalists? It might not be 100% of what you want, but if we went down the sort of path being suggested by Philip Bowie, that, you know, Scotland could set whatever taxes it wanted, the entire welfare system, your fisheries system, they're sort of all down to you. You know, maybe we'd still share some embassies and military and the monarchy, but the UK itself would be, I don't know, you know, a very small fraction of overall government activity. Is that a final destination point that could stick, or would that further accelerate the causes to independence? You know, I guess I'm asking you what might be an acceptable compromise here.
Yeah, and it's a good stimulating question to ask, Mark. Just a couple of things in your comments there. I think the SNP had 108 MSPs and MPs, which is quite a change to 10, 15 years ago. And in fact, in 2015, we were once the second biggest party because there was 2 outside the party, which then dwarfed by 100% the sizes of the then Labour, Liberal and Conservative parties, well, the 2 SNP exiles, shall we call them at the time. But to the substantial part of your question, is there anything that would that could fall short, that would be satisfied with, that would maybe stop the push for independence? And I think looking back historically, and again, if I looked at the Irish parallel, I mean, Ireland really only started wanting some land questions in limited amount. Having lost the Parliament in 1801, which arguably lack of those political powers caused the tragic famine in Ireland. But after that, there was land powers they wanted, and the reluctance of the Westminster psyche to give away some powers was just led and led and led. Now, as I said in my opening remarks, I can't get somebody in the Home Office to raise the pen to let me have a few fishermen and fishing boats from non-EEA countries, primarily Philippines and West Africa. So if you can't get them doing that, if they have to believe and behave in a centralised way, it's very difficult. So yes, you might have a point where there may be a number of Scottish nationalists who might say, well, do you know, I wouldn't be this far on the bandwagon now had they given us this, this and that. Had there been a second question in the referendum of 2014 and say we had full fiscal autonomy, who knows where that would have left the wind in the sails. But then the Westminster holding of stuff, unnecessarily you could argue, is the one that opens the mind up to the potential, well, actually, why are we hanging about with Westminster? Why are we hanging about with governments we don't vote for, we don't elect, we don't choose? You know, if Frau Merkel was the Prime Minister of the UK or England, let's just put it as pejoratively, as provocatively as I can, do we think that the media and the chatterati and the people would accept Monsieur Macron or Frau Merkel that they didn't vote for in a unified England-France or a unified England-Germany? I don't think so. And Scotland's a nation. It's a nation within a union, and it's a nation that's rights are not respected. In 2014, vote to stay in the UK and you'll get to stay in the European Union. Well, I think was it 21 months later, that was shown to be utter bunkum. And we weren't able to stay in the European Union because somebody else had decided for us we were being taken out of the European Union. So I think there was a time for your question. Perhaps it would have bought off some people, if you like, but not now. That ship has sailed. We look at Iceland, we look at Norway, we look at Ireland, look at the Ileanan. Yep. Why are we in this, and why are we navel-gazing about this? This debate could end with Scottish independence. We could move on and live Norway, like Norway, Iceland, Ireland, etc. And I think the time is that ship has sailed, Mark. But a good question. Thank you.
Andrew, can I put a similar question with a slightly different twist to you? You're a unionist. Yeah. You want the union to hold together. Yeah. But what constitutional changes would you make, if any? I mean, do you the West Lothian question, I think, has never been addressed. The article by Nick Timothy that Philip referenced and that we've linked to in the chat points out that Scottish members of Parliament, because of the constitutional position, are still raising questions about English education policy. Do you think there are further changes, either to more devolution or to less, that would strengthen the union? Or have we arrived at some sort of constitutional utopia where nothing needs to be altered or changed, and this is the perfect constitutional structure for the UK evermore?
I think that the day that the United Kingdom arrives at constitutional utopia is a day where there's a long way off. I mean, what's really interesting, I think, about this debate today is you've actually got two MPs that are representing parties that originally, when devolution was first mooted, were against. The Conservatives were against because we thought it would damage the fabric of our United Kingdom, and the Scottish National Party, quite understandably so, were against devolution because they thought it would damage their campaign for independence. Lord Robertson of Ellen, of course, of the Labour Party, famously said at the time that devolution would end the campaign for independence completely. And take
stone dead. Kill it stone dead, he said.
Kill it stone dead. That's exactly the quote.
I remind him of it often whenever I see him.
Angus. Look, I don't think that the devolution settlement is in any way perfect as it stands right now. I think anything that was created by the Labour Party is far from perfect. I think that it was a settlement that was created primarily with the aim of making sure that the Labour Party was in power in Scotland forever more. You only have to look at their recent electoral results in Scotland to see how well that went for them. But there's only one party in the United Kingdom right now committed to actually making a success of devolution and making it work properly. And when Angus talks about, holding on to power, I mean, the Conservative government since 2010, first as a coalition and then as governing by itself, have devolved more and faster to Scotland than any other government previous to it. Do I think there's an imbalance? Well, we are trying to address that imbalance. I do worry about the idea of a federal United Kingdom and an English Parliament, simply because I feel that whilst we spoke so much about levelling up in the last general election, there would be quite a few citizens in the north of England who would feel that in an English Parliament, their voices, opinions, and matters of concern for them would be outweighed purely by the population density and the amount of MPs or members of the English Parliament be elected from the south of England. But so what we're doing to address the imbalance in the United Kingdom is actually devolving more to the regions and cities in England and Wales. And I think that where there is divergence, where I think it's very good that we can fight, for example, as we're speaking right now, coronavirus as one United Kingdom with what we're calling a 4-nation plan. And let's not beat around the bush. Yes, of course, there are political disagreements, and where we diverge, we diverge. But behind the scenes, the health secretaries and the chief medical officers of all 4 nations of the United Kingdom are working very, very closely together. And I think that where that can happen, it should. And I think that shows the benefits of our United Kingdom. Do I think that we've reached constitutional utopia? Absolutely not. That was one of the reasons why we set up the Smith Commission in 2015 to see what we could do to enhance support and make better devolution in Scotland. I still think we've got a way to go before we get there. I'm not convinced that a federal setup in the United Kingdom would be the best way to go. And neither do I think that in moving to a federal system, you would in any way dampen the flames of those who are calling for a full independence, because, it is the rationale for the Scottish National Party's existence is to campaign for a separate Scotland. That's absolutely fine. That's their position, and we respect that. We fight against it, but it is their position. And I don't think that would be in any way dampened if we were to move towards a federal system.
I want to bring Philip Booth back in just a moment, but just a follow-up question, Andrew, for you there, in terms of devolution. I mean, do you think Philip raised the Andy Burnham question?
Yeah.
Do you think it would be wiser to sort of take a leaf out of more devolved European countries' books and to sort of say, well, look, the UK government's going to allow schools to open as of, say, June the 1st. But, whether they do or not in Manchester or Liverpool or Bristol or Edinburgh or Cardiff or Belfast is going to be a decision for the relevant local authority there. Whereas what we've heard from Westminster is not just schools can open on the 1st of June, ordered from some central planning committee is the precise year groups that will return at various sort of phases. I mean, can't that be handed over to local authorities or the constituent national authorities of the UK?
I think there's going to be a lot to learn from how we have dealt with the lockdown, dealt with the pandemic as a whole when we come out of it. I don't think right now is the time to review the setup between local authority governments and the central governments of the United Kingdom. I'm a Conservative. I believe that power should be devolved down. I think that the closer to the electors, the better for lawmakers, it makes for better law, I think it makes for better accountability, and I think that the more power that are in the hands of devolved mayors and local authorities, the better. But I mean, I'm not going to question the Secretary of State for Education's decision to encourage schools to return in the second of June, nor why the Department for Education are encouraging different year groups to attend when they do. There are reasons for that. I don't know if this is the right place to go into that, but of course, I absolutely believe that we should be devolving power down. And, you know, talking on Philip's point about the German example, I remember being at university when my German politics lecturer throwing his hands up in the air, trying to describe the devolution settlement in the United Kingdom as something that only the United Kingdom could have come up with. It was so messy and to a German just impossible to get his head around. And you know, maybe there is something to learn from that. Maybe we should look at how we address those issues as we move forward. But I don't think that a federal United Kingdom setup is the way to do that. More powers to the nations, certainly to the regions, to the cities, as we're doing already, I think would be a much more sensible way to proceed.
Okay, Philip, let me come to you on this question of devolution, and I'm going to take a question from David Middleton. I should have told our attendees as well that even if you don't want to ask a question, if you go into the Q&A box, you can upvote the questions that you want me to put to our panelists, and the more upvotes they get, the closer to the top of the screen they get. It's not, the IEA is not a pure democracy, it is a benign dictatorship, but nevertheless, I'm keen to see what our audience would like to hear. And Philip, David Middleton asks, the four nations, he says, are really irrelevant. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are so much smaller than England. The key question is surely whether England should be governed in a much less centralised way. And perhaps I could just add my spin on that. Do you think that a sort of federal solution is really possible where one constituent part is, 80% or so, whatever it is, of the population? If you look at, the German Länder or the US states, it's much more diverse. I mean, California, the largest state, is what? 10% of the US population. England is 80% or so of the UK population. Is it really more about England than it is about the four nations?
Okay. On the first issue, so England is what, 85% or something of the population of the United Kingdom. So what happens in England, of course, matters very much, and we spend a lot of our time focusing on Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And I think I made fairly clear in my remarks, but I could expand at rather greater length, that I think it's absolutely vital as well that we decentralise power in England to local authorities, match revenue raising powers with spending powers, so we don't have the situation where, as we do at the moment, where they are effectively branch offices of Westminster. They have responsibilities which are laid out. They get grants from government. They raise a small proportion of their own revenue, and actually, all the economic analysis suggests that that's the worst of all worlds. That if you decentralise spending and keep tax centralised, you get the worst results, because you don't have the accountability of local politicians to local electorates. I would also decentralise regulation. Why do we have a smoking ban which applies all throughout England? Why didn't we allow local authorities to take their own decisions on such matters? Sunday shopping regulations, you could argue the same about those as well. So yeah, I very much take the point about decentralisation in England. Now, one thing that troubles me really is actually the use of the word devolution. I mean, politically, I'm a liberal, and I like to think of power or responsibility being handed up from the people to local government to central government, rather than sort of being all starting accruing in central government and then being, in a rather patronising way, handed down. And as we see with the current government's policy, in an incredibly bureaucratic way, handed down by these city agreements and so on. Does it matter that the England would be a huge proportion of a federal structure? I don't think so, as long as you really do ensure that the United Kingdom as a whole has a relatively small and clear set of responsibilities. So if it's only foreign policy and defence, and any other responsibilities are by agreement between the nations concerned. So if Scotland wants to join England for monetary policy and England is okay with that, then the two nations can agree on that together. I don't think it really matters that England would be a huge portion of the other the total United Kingdom in a federal structure. I think what matters more is whether or not Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland are viable countries given their populations. I think it's very true that Scotland is. Wales and Northern Ireland, well, in a federal structure, you could just have two entities, Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. That would be a matter for the people of the nations concerned.
Okay. Angus, I've got two questions that I want to put to you, one from Emily Stevens and one from Christopher Marshall on the viability, the financial viability of Scottish independence and indeed the potential appetite for it. Emily asks, how would Scotland have survived financially if it were already independent in terms of business loans, furlough schemes and all of the rest, and asserts Westminster has bailed Scotland out. So can you talk a little to your view of how much do you believe Scotland is reliant on Westminster? And Christopher Marshall asks, did Scotland miss its only chance for independence in 2014? We've now left the EU, or we're about to. It would now surely be more difficult for Scotland to separate from the UK, in addition to the sort of economic crash that we're in at the moment, which would have a deleterious effect on Scottish finances. So do you think there might be a case that the Scottish population have sort of are experiencing one major constitutional upheaval, one huge financial upheaval based on public health, and might not have an appetite for a third, even if they are strongly against the first two? Angus, over to you on those 2 points.
Yeah, I think on the word upheaval, as you put it, or constitutional changes and alterations, as I might put them, once you've dipped your toe in the water once, you're not scared of water in the future, and you might even go into your ankles or your knees the next time. So I don't think that these changes are going to scare people at all. I think people are going to look for better governance. And on that, I'm just looking. I was puzzled by one of Andrew Bowie's response there to an English Parliament idea, because the North of England MPs might be outvoted or outnumbered. They would form about 20% of an English Parliament, and the Scottish MPs form about 9% of the UK Parliament. So that would put twice the number. And if an English Parliament can be argued against for the North of England with the basis of 20 MPs, well, welcome, Andrew. I knew this Damascus conversion would happen sometime, and I'm glad it's on the IEA's webinar. To the point of, I think it was a lady who asked about money and can Scotland survive.
Emily Stevens' question on, is Westminster bailing you out with all of these, helpful schemes? Could you have made similarly generous arrangements alone?
Yeah, I mean, I could mention the Channel Islands and h-Eileanan or whatever, but I mean, I think some of the best examples are maybe Iceland and the Faroe Islands again. I mean, Iceland has got a better system for furloughing people at the moment during this crisis than the UK has, a better amount of money for people, up to nearly €2,000 a month. The Faroe Islands, which is 1% of Scotland's population, is managing to give €2,500 a month. So you don't need to worry too much about an independent Scotland if you can find us in a neighbourhood where our neighbours can do that so much better than the controls and the powers that be in England. What's wrong in England isn't really money or finance, anything, it's attitude. It's a feeling that the teaching moral lessons with money and that a universal basic income might somehow be bad for people, or that people would become lazy with furlough support during the time of crisis and wouldn't want jobs. People want to work. I mean, I'm sure Andrew Bowie, certainly myself, are probably finding ourselves even busier at the moment that we don't have time to waste travelling up and down to London. So I think the idea that Scotland alone would be struggling, not in a UK that hasn't paid its way since 2001, that's had a deficit each and every year since 2001, that's had a debt each and every year since about 1911, I think it is, that we'd somehow be uniquely struggling, I don't think it's one for the birds. And I would add to that that I'd rather us be in the situation of Iceland with our own currency, or the situation of Norway with our own currency, or the situation of Denmark. Having your own currency, I think, would be important as well in an independent Scotland. And I think that in itself would help a lot. I mean, where's the UK getting its money from? Well, one of the members of the Monetary Policy Committee said, essentially, they're just basically printing it and handing it over to the government at the moment. That's where the money is coming from. J.K. Galbraith, the American economist, the Canadian American economist, said that money is created so easily that the mind was perturbed or upset, something along those lines when I understood how. So, yeah, for people in Scotland, we don't need the mothering that some will tell us we do from Westminster. And Ireland, who was the worst bet of all of the United Kingdom 100 years ago, is now the best part of the British Isles. GDP per capita is higher than in Mother England, as they would have looked at it in the Victorian times.
Andrew, let me come back to you. There's one question that's been directly put to you, and then I want to ask your thoughts on the economic viability of an independent Scotland, even if you're opposed to it, obviously, but whether you even think it's viable. Tom Packer asks, it's picking up on your earlier remarks, Andrew, is there any evidence people in the north feel less English than people in the south? If you did have an English parliament, wouldn't it push back against the UK parliament in very much the way that the devolved assemblies do? Might actually lead to some degree of English unity. And then on the point of viability, I'm not that interested in getting into the tedious question of the Barnett formula and transfer payments, but would Scotland be viable? Alex Hammond says, if we look at the top 10 richest countries in the world, measured in terms of GDP per capita, none of them have a population over 10 million. Places like Luxembourg, Qatar, Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, Brunei are thriving, and surely that's in part due to their smaller size. Might not Scotland, is not merely viable, isn't it? It could be the road to riches if we look at smaller successful nations elsewhere. So those 2 points, the sort of English unity or disintegration because of an English parliament, and the viability and indeed roaring success of smaller nations.
So thanks, Mark.
Think of the riches, Andrew.
To answer the question about do people in the north of England feel less English than the south, obviously not. As having a father-in-law from Yorkshire, I could testify to the fact that he is just as passionately English as anybody that I've met from the south of England. However, it's not for me to argue for an English parliament. That's for the people in England to discuss. And I remember the last time of asking whether there was a referendum or whether there should be devolution in terms of a similar setup to the parliament that we have in Scotland to the north of England. And I can't remember the exact date of that, but I remember John Prescott led the campaign for that. The answer was a resounding no, and I've yet to see any comprehensive study suggesting that people across England, or north, south, east, west, are in any ways moving towards the idea of having an English parliament as well as a UK parliament on top of that. But as I said, I mean, it's not it's an idea that certainly has merit and worth looking into. It's just not something I don't think that the English people are campaigning for at the minute, and I don't know if it would add very much value.
Switzerland makes a good case.
What does add value is devolving power down to cities and regions to people that actually making sure that people that are making decisions are as close to people that elect them as possible. And we spoke about the financial viability of an independent Scotland. I've never believed for 1 minute that Scotland couldn't afford to go it alone as an independent country. I've heard some people describe Scottish Conservatives as believing that we think that Scotland's too wee and too poor and couldn't manage by itself. That is nonsense. Scotland could, of course, manage by itself, but it would, of course, have to take some very serious decisions. Budget Wilson's Growth Commission, which was commissioned by the Scottish government just last year, predicted that an independent Scotland would start off with a budget deficit of 6% of GDP, and that there would be some hard decisions to take by an independent Scottish government as it made its way into the world being independent. It would have to, the Commission suggested, adopt the pound, but it would do so without having any influence over the central bank whatsoever. And then it would adopt its own currency, but as yet there was no concrete guidelines or view on what that currency should be or what it should be pegged alongside. And I think that that's asking people to play and take risks with their mortgages, their savings, and their pensions, which I don't think many Scots are willing to do. But of course, Scotland could manage on its own, and I don't think using terms like the UK government bailing out Scotland is in any way helpful whatsoever. Scottish people are taxpayers, just as people in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland are taxpayers to the UK Treasury. But of course, Scotland has benefited from being a part of the United Kingdom, the fifth largest economy in the world, which has been able to give £3.5 billion of support to Scotland, to support Scottish business. The coronavirus job retention scheme has saved 374,000 Scottish jobs, all told. And just last week, we gave £58 million more to the Scottish government to deal with the crisis that the entire United Kingdom is facing regarding coronavirus in care homes. So whilst it's not fair, and I don't think helpful to say that the UK government has bailed out Scotland because the Scottish people are taxpayers, and it's absolutely right for the Scottish government to take decisions in devolved areas of where that money is spent, I think that we are much better off, and we are much safer, and we are much wealthier as a part of a wider United Kingdom that's able to punch above its weight in the world. This is one of the largest economies in the world, and that can take measures like that without having too much of a damaging effect on its overall economic performance.
Okay. Philip, I want to come back to you. Eric Blomquist asked a question, and I'm going to add a supplementary to it. Eric, good to have you with us. He asks, Philip, how do you believe the issue of taxation would be addressed in a more federal, decentralised Germany-like UK? Should more tax monies be both levied and retained at the local levels? And if so, isn't it likely that the Westminster bureaucracy will strongly resist diminution of their budgets and their power? And I'd like to add to that the question of sort of regulatory devolution, if you like, that we might have different laws or rules governing schools and pubs and restaurants and traffic signs in various different parts of the UK. This echoes a little bit the sort of Brexit debate. Do you think that there is a problem with regulatory divergence leading to friction in the market, that, you know, your product that is legal in Derbyshire suddenly can't be sold in Nottinghamshire or whatever, or the protocols that you've got used to in driving around in Manchester no longer apply in Liverpool? Is there a trade-off here between allowing devolution and address Eric's tax point, but also allowing it on regulation that actually generates friction in trade as the downside, even if the experimentation and better calibration of policies helps at local level?
Okay, now the answer to the second part of the question, your bit of the question is quite complex and almost quite academic. Let me just let me put that aside for the moment and deal with Eric's question first. You bet there will be pushback from the proposals that I made in federal Britain, because it talks about reducing hugely the responsibilities of the United Kingdom government. Obviously, those responsibilities would be taken at some other level of government, although I'd rather there be much less government. I'd rather governments did much less in general. But the United Kingdom would have a relatively small set of responsibilities and would only have to raise taxes sufficient to service debt and provide for things like defence, foreign policy and so on. Very, very small level of UK-wide taxes. All other taxes would simply be set at the national or local levels. And not only that, I don't think Parliament for the UK would actually have to meet all that often. Perhaps it could just meet once a month to deal with that relatively small range of responsibilities. So certainly there will be a lot of pushback by bureaucrats and the political class against that type of thing, which reduce significantly their power and influence. Now, when it comes to deregulatory power and frictions, this is actually why I alluded to in my opening remarks that the federal solution worked much better when the UK was a member of the European Union. There's a lot of deregulatory regulatory decentralisation that you could do, which is pretty irrelevant when it comes to the type of problems that you mentioned. For example, if you had different rules in relation to smoking indoors in Liverpool as compared with Manchester, all that would mean is that if you happen to travel to Liverpool, you might not be able to smoke a cigarette in a pub, whereas in Manchester you could. There are no problems with that type of regulatory diversity, that is the term I prefer to use. However, when it comes to traded products, then yes, there can be frictions, because there might be a rule in England, for example, which requires all lawnmowers to have a certain specification, and a different rule in Scotland. So what happens if you then want to trade lawnmowers between England and Scotland? And it's precisely because of this that you've got you've got centralisation in the United States and centralisation in the European Union, because as soon as you give the federal level the responsibility for regulating in those areas which are related to trade, the regulation automatically gets centralised at that level. And the regulators at those levels can always find a reason somehow why a particular regulation might be used to inhibit trade. So they always find a reason to centralise regulation. And you can see that's happening in the United States. You can see that's happening in the European Union. There are ways around that, but of course, when I first proposed federal Britain, it was when the United Kingdom as a whole was in the European Union, and those sorts of issues were at that time determined at the European Union level, so we wouldn't have had to worry about them at the UK level. But as soon as you give the central entity the power to regulate trade, then you tend to find it starts poking its finger into almost any area of regulation which has some even remote connection to trade, and regulation just gets centralised at that level.
Okay, thank you. Angus, I want to bring you back in and touching on the currency question, really.
Yeah.
This was a matter of heated debate at the time of the independence referendum. I should confess, from my point of view, I've never really understood the problem. If an independent Scotland wished to keep the pound sterling, it could do so. I guess you could choose to adopt the euro, the US dollar, or whatever currency you wanted. But Carol Jones asks, if Scotland wishes to pursue full fiscal independence, the presumption has to be, surely, that Scotland will have to implement its own independent monetary policy with its own central bank to avoid the previous and current problems in the Eurozone. And on a similar theme, Michael Everson asks, and I will put this to the other panelists as well after we've heard from you, Angus, does the panel agree that the currency question is a red herring? Ireland adopted its own currency pegged to sterling, then let it float freely, then pegged it back to the euro, then adopted the euro. Estonia did the same, as well as other countries. So your thoughts on the currency question and what your preferred outcome will be if you achieve your political objective of independence?
Yeah, I mean, I will get round to this. There's a couple of points I'd just like to pick up on, if I may, Mark, and I will do it quickly of the other things. Yeah, on sort of trade, I believe it's California that sets the standards mainly for the United States, because California have the toughest regulations. So everybody just designs for the Californian state, the state of California, and they can get into every other state market in the USA. So usually the tougher regulations. So the states, Europe, and to an extent China, the big regulation centers in the world, and probably within the states, California is disproportionate because they're higher standards, and that tends to rule on that one. Somebody else asked a question on the panel, which I did say would try and answer, about the Treasury and COVID. And it's an important point about the Treasury and COVID. If the Treasury is going to be backing England's choice on as regards health, or England's needs as regards health, so the furlough scheme and all we've seen, then if Wales, let's say, to try and move it out of this area, needs a longer furlough scheme in Wales, then the Treasury should be backing Welsh health as much as it's been backing English health, and not backing Welsh health as a consequence of English health. So everything in the rest of the UK comes as an afterthought to England. If England needs it, we'll get consequentials. If Wales needs it, it doesn't happen unless, and necessarily there's no consequentials. But I don't think there's ever a decision been made that's caused for Wales as consequentials for anywhere else. Bowie also mentioned Andrew Wilson's Growth Commission paper. One I did oppose at conference in the SNP, but he did mention there was 6% deficit. Oh, if the UK could only have 6% deficit of GDP in the coming year, how things move on. And it wasn't a paper I agree with.
But sure, isn't the point is it's 6%?
Yeah, current account matter. Yeah. Wouldn't that be fantastic for the UK in the coming year? Rather than the big bogeyman stick being waved in independent Scotland only 4 months ago, it's now would be grabbed at with glad hands by the UK, which I do find to be quite amazing. But to your main point, I think your point, Mark, was the currency question. And 180 currencies across the world. I'm going back to G.K. Galbraith, the money, the invention, or the money is created, it repels the mind, it's so easy. It's not a huge problem for us. I mean, Ireland has done this, the Balkans, as your question has done this. It is to a large extent red herring. What is useful having your own currency, and we can see it at the moment, is the ability just to print cash, which is what the UK is needing to do in the middle of this crisis. And boy, are the printers going, and the USA are the same. Or sorry, the button is going to create the cash, put them in a ledger somewhere else, or put in a deficit somewhere else. But as you owe it to yourself, it's effectively nothing. So that is where having your own currency is vital. And in Iceland, there's a perennial discussion having the world's smallest currency, because they do see the volatility of being such a small currency, but they do see that, the 2008 crash, which has still got a UK hangover, is long history in Iceland. It's hardly remembered, the 2008 crash. We probably remember it more because we're still living with the effects of the ill-chosen austerity, the stupid austerity of George Osborne, than places like Iceland who've long moved on because they've had the independence to do so and not been stuck with the guff and the nonsense that we in Scotland have had to swallow. And I think we're maybe the last in Europe being stuck in this failing union that has given us all these difficulties. In Ireland, remember how they mocked Ireland, remember how they mocked Iceland in 2008? They didn't mock them for long after. And if Scotland had been taking the wisdom of 2014, we wouldn't be stuck to these pile of people we don't vote for.
Angus, I just want to be clear then, your ideal final outcome is that Scotland would have its own independent currency. It wouldn't have sterling and it wouldn't join the euro. There would be a new Scottish currency that would have its own central bank and Scotland would have its own monetary policy.
Correct, yeah.
Okay. Andrew, your thoughts on the currency issue was such a huge issue at the time of the referendum and the viability or otherwise, or indeed what the nationalists wanted if they got their way. And I can see both you and Philip aching to come back on the austerity question post 2008.
I saw that, yeah.
Not necessarily directly connected, but let me have your thoughts on that. Then I'll come back to Philip.
Well, firstly, can I say that what I've always admired about Angus is his independence of thought. Within the Scottish National Party. And,
they admire it within the party too, Andrew.
Yes, I can imagine. And his independence to actually say what he thinks. And you know what? I genuinely do appreciate that, because at least Angus is honest with the Scottish people, and he actually thinks the best way to go in terms of moving to an independent Scotland would be to have a separate currency. One of the biggest issues in the last referendum was that people weren't actually quite sure what was on offer. Was it an independent currency? Were we going to be adopting pound sterling, but without having a central bank there, or were we going to adopt the euro? So I think that was one of the major issues of contention in the last referendum, because of the uncertainty about what the Scottish people were actually being promised. And as I said earlier, I don't think that we should be playing.
Membership of the European Union was a large one.
We should be. Well, I was going to come back on that, Angus, as well, because you mentioned that the Scottish independence referendum at the time, people were told that they were voting to stay in the UK and that the UK would be staying in the European Union. And of course, actually, yes, that was the case at the time in September 2014. But David Cameron had promised a referendum on on our membership of the European Union in January 2030, and it said so in the 2014 Scotland's White Paper, which I'm sure is a book, a document that you're very fond of, Angus. It did say that
I've got your copy here, Andrew.
Remaining in the United Kingdom would mean that we would be in a country that was having a referendum on whether or not to maintain our membership of the European Union. So I think that's a bit of a red herring. On austerity and why the UK is still grappling with some of the hangover of the 2008 financial crash, well, I would suggest that the reason that the UK is still grappling with some of the hangover of the 2008 financial crisis is because we did not take as radical or as hard steps as were adopted in countries like Ireland, which really did suffer through austerity in the immediate aftermath of 2008, to get them back on a firm footing economically. We took the decision that we had to implement very tough policies, and for many people, the years between 2008 and very recently were incredibly tough indeed. But we did not go as far as countries like Ireland did, or neither did we have to, because of the overwhelming strength of the United Kingdom economy. And the other question was, I think the original question was on Ireland, its currency, and why
it's not a problem. I mean, if the Republic of Ireland can do it, Scotland can do it. Was the gist of the question.
This is something that I've always struggled to answer, because yes, I mean, the simple answer to that is, if the Republic of Ireland can do it, of course Scotland can do it. But my point is, why should it have to? Why should the people of Scotland and businesses in Scotland have to go through the uncertainty and everything that it would bring from decoupling of our membership, a 300-odd-year-old union, and everything that would mean for our economy, for business, for individual people's jobs, their mortgages, their pensions? I don't think that people of Scotland need that uncertainty in their lives, certainly not at the minute as we're going through coronavirus. And so the sensible approach would be to maintain our membership of the United Kingdom, improve certainly the devolution settlement, and actually maybe improve devolution within Scotland. How about devolving some powers down from a very centralising government in Edinburgh down to local authorities in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire? That's something that I would certainly be very happy with. So that's what I think the best solution to the current situation would be.
We're I'm going to try and squeeze another one or two questions in, but Philip, could I have your thoughts on the currency question? I don't know what your prescription would be, but I'd be interested also, in addition to or instead of your prescription, your analysis of the viability or the strength of an independent Scottish currency, or what currency options they might pursue.
Okay, no, as Andrew has just said, in Iceland and Ireland, they did have proper austerity. In the UK, we had falls in real government spending of 0.5% per annum on average, which which has taken government spending back to a level of a proportion of GDP, which is actually greater than at any time in the 2000s. So we haven't really had austerity in the way that maybe Angus would really like that they experienced in Ireland and Iceland. I'm not sure. Now,
unemployment was never as low in Iceland as it was in the UK.
Well, when it comes to the question of the currency, Scotland could easily enough be a Montenegro and adopt any currency from around the world which it wishes and borrow in that currency. I think the problem within the European Union is not so much that there's a single currency, and not so much that the monetary policy is therefore separated effectively from fiscal policy. It's that before the financial crisis, firstly, the weaker countries were able to borrow large sums of money and get into debt, effectively using the ECB as a mechanism for their government's borrowing. The risk premiums really collapsed between different governments. Markets were not distinguishing between the Greek government and the French government and the German government, because they actually believed that they would bail each other out. If you have a Montenegro type solution where you're not part of a currency union, you just adopt a different country's currency, which Scotland could do by adopting the euro, like Montenegro, or adopting the pound, then you really do have to keep honest, because the markets know that you won't be able to borrow from any central bank to get yourself out of trouble, and therefore your fiscal policy is very much more disciplined. It does, of course, make it rather more difficult to deal with a pandemic or a war or something like that, when you might feel as if you want more monetary policy.
Have your own currency,
flexibility, yes, and have your own currency and be able to borrow in your own currency. But I think the real question about the financial viability of Scotland with its own currency or not is whether or not it's financially viable on the types of policies that the SNP, or for that matter, other socialist parties in Scotland would like to implement. Because those other small countries which we've talked about, which have been very successful, either have special circumstances surrounding them, Norway and oil. Well, you may say Scotland. You may say Scotland and oil, but that you can't guarantee. I don't think that you can benefit from oil in the future as much as Norway has in the past.
Oh, so we should have been independent in the past. Thank you.
If you have been independent in the past, it might be a different story.
Thank you.
I think the record of those countries which are relatively small and successful is that they have low taxes, low levels of regulation, including employment regulation, low levels of social spending. And of course, that reflects very much Scottish classical liberal history.
Denmark, Sweden, Ireland.
Forgotten in policy circles today.
Iceland.
Well, Angus, let me bring you in here. Then I'm going to put a final question to our panelists. I mean, on this point of, no countries are identically alike, but you were nodding enthusiastically when I was rattling off, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and other small countries that have done well. You mentioned,
I think Iceland was one that made me particularly nod.
Iceland, but as Philip and Andrew have pointed out, I mean, when 2008 came, the fiscal tightening was pretty strict, and more generally, those smaller countries that are rich are pursuing much less government spending as a proportion of national income than the UK, and certainly, therefore, even less than that advocated by the SNP. Will an independent Scotland suddenly rediscover Adam Smith and go for slashing taxes and getting spending way down? That seems to be the route for success for these other guys, right?
No. What we see around us in our Scandinavian friends are actually high taxing, high spending. In fact, there's an interesting TED talk, which I will encourage any listeners to go and look at it. Where is it easiest to become a millionaire or a billionaire? And you'd actually find that what is called the American dream is more easily achieved within Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. And the easiest place to become a billionaire per capita is Iceland. But those 3-4 countries with their high spend, high tax Nordic approaches are the best of all. And in fact, we should all maybe realise that from Andrew Bowie to Philip Booth to yourselves, everybody's a social democrat now during the coronavirus crisis. Everybody's looking to government. Everybody's looking to spending. Everybody's looking to the help of the state. The free marketeer who can look after himself and help himself is currently cap in hand to the social democratic state to try and help them. So this coronavirus tells us that Scotland is definitely further loosening the strings and following the path of Ireland. But it's also telling us that the approaches politically are ones that are coming from the left, and the left is winning, and the left of centre social democratic approach is the winning approach. And the successful countries round about Scotland, their arc of again prosperity, which never saw their GDP per capita lower than the UK's. Ireland was the only one that's any worse on the unemployment. Norway and Iceland were still better than the UK after the austerity. The left of centre, the approaches that Scotland wants to join and to leave the failing UK behind are the ones that are winning. And this, at the time of this apex of social democracy that we're living through at the moment, is one that we should perhaps look back on as halcyon days that will cause the changes that will have us moving away. We're starting at social distancing to political distancing, to be all meeting up as friends at the United Nations in years to come. Perhaps, who knows, Andrew Bowie could be Scotland's ambassador at the UN. Maybe I'll be his deputy.
Well, there you
Happy
go.
days.
That's quite an offer. I'm minded of the IEA's approach. I don't think there's anybody in the IEA who would abolish government altogether, but I think that most of us are along the lines that my good friend Grover Norquist always says in the United States of America. I don't want to abolish government. I just want it to be small enough for the people to be able to drown it in the bath if they have to.
And you can't just take one aspect of Nordic societies and say, well, if we copied that in the United Kingdom or in Scotland, everything will be like it is in Sweden.
I mentioned many of them.
You'd have to take some of the other aspects too, such as the fact that they are some of the most deregulated countries in the world, that they have, to much larger degree, private elements in the provision of health and education.
Healthcare, yeah.
You can't just sort of cherry pick a bit and say, well, if we take that bit, actually that might be the bit.
Which bit are you cherry picking now?
That might be the bit that's really holding the Nordic countries back from being even richer. So
absolutely. I mean,
a range of variables, and let's say, choose that one.
All we can say is they're better. They might not be as good as they could be, but they're better than what we have. That's what
no statutory minimum wage in Denmark, incidentally.
Yeah, it's so high. In fact, they found in Denmark, I think the McDonald's wages on average are something like $22 an hour, and in the United States of America, they're $7.20, about a third of that. And the price of a burger wasn't much different. All that happened in Denmark was that the greater slice of the pie was going to the workers than going to the owners, which was a fantastic system.
Gents, we're definitely going to invite you all back for a new IEA webinar on what we can learn from Scandinavia and what's going right and what's going wrong there. And in fact, I'll ask Emma to link into the chat to our book, Scandinavian Unexceptionalism was the name of the book, but learning from some.
Can we each be in a different capital? Can we each be in a different capital?
Sure. I just want to finish with panelists' last remarks, and I'm going to take another question from Tom Packer, which might just be the peg, because I'm going to ask each of you to make a prediction. Not about what you want to happen, but what you think the State of the Union will be by the end of this decade in 2030. What do you think, if anything, would have changed? And that goes a little to Tom Packer's point. He says, is there any example of going from quite a unitary system to a very decentralised one where the Union lasted? Or does change of that type tend to lead to the big breakup? He says the big example he can think of is Norway and Sweden, arguably Southern Ireland too, which then became independent. So he's suggesting that perhaps we're on a journey, or there's momentum behind something that's happening here rather than just sort of staging posts. So Philip, let me start with you, then I'll take Angus, and then Andrew, I'll give you the last word. What's your prediction for where we'll be at in 2030?
You originally said the end of the decade, which of course is December this year. So
oh, you're one of these pedants.
I honestly, no, I don't know. To be honest, I don't think the current settlement within England is stable, because it's just essentially a stitch up between various different bureaucratic classes and is sucking power out of local authorities. And I think eventually that will just collapse under the weight of its own lack of logic. Within the United Kingdom, really not sure at all. I suspect that we'll be pretty much as we are today, in fact.
Okay. Angus, your thoughts, wherever you want us to be or you want Scotland to be, where do you think you'll be in 2030?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the question is leading us a train of thought. I'm trying to find an example to sort of encounter the question, but I can't readily. I mean, the idea that the unitary leads to decentralised, I mean, we've seen Lord George Robertson get it wrong, killing independence, stone dead independence came to 45%, and we know that the Boris Johnson running scared of having a second independence referendum because we know fully well where it's going to go. I think the thing that might be the biggest driver of change is inequality. We're seeing levels of inequality back around the 1920s in many countries, not just in the UK. And sometimes where you have to have, when you play Monopoly, you have to kick the board over after a while because somebody's winning it or severely reorganise what's going on. Nobody loses their incentives. They start again, and it's sort of a fairer system where more of the talents of the people are used and employed. At the moment, we've got a situation where we're not really using a lot of people's talents. If you're in the bottom 20% and born into that, you're going to likely be staying there. It's not very socially mobile. So we need a situation that's going to create that sort of change before that change is forced upon us all in a way that might not be very nice for anybody. It's hard to say. I mean, I think the final point I just raised is there was a book written about 15, 20 years ago called The Size of Nations by two Italian authors whose surnames escape me. But it said the most efficient size of nations were around the 5 to 12 million mark. And they didn't even mention Scotland. But, if we take more of their advice and go for it and would stop the navel gazing, and they don't have these discussions in Ireland, as I said in the beginning, probably in Norway either. They're not looking to go back to the nonsense they had. They are happily independent and striving forward well ahead of us. And we could learn a lot from them. So that's what I hope would be going towards independence. No great surprise. I hope Andrew has from this hour has his Damascus conversion that I've been praying for the last
And so, Andrew, where do you think we'll be in 2030? Will you have taken the SNP's gracious offer of being Scotland's ambassador to the UN with Angus as your deputy, or are you predicting a somewhat different future?
I think I'd be worried for Scotland's reputation on the world stage if it was myself and Angus that were representing us at the United Nations somehow. But,
we'd make friends and influence people. Come on.
Absolutely. I think it is, it's very difficult to predict but 10 weeks into the future at this stage in British politics. I mean, this time last year, we were a week away from Theresa May resigning as Prime Minister. Brexit looked like it was going nowhere, and Boris Johnson had still to officially announce that he was running to become leader of the United Kingdom. We did not predict we'd have a general election by the end of the year. Certainly didn't predict a whopping Conservative majority, nor that we would be, obviously, nobody could have predicted what we're going through right now. I think when we take a step back and we look at what we're going through right now in the future, we will, I think, recognise that whilst there has been differences, whilst we have diverged as different parts of the United Kingdom, rightly in many ways regarding the medical and scientific advice as to what was best for where we all lived, that we had much more in common than we did not. And I think that working together, we have managed to come through this we will manage to come through this much stronger. And I think the United Kingdom might actually benefit from the common sense of purpose that we're all feeling, I think exemplified by the people across the country, from Cornwall up to Wick, who stand on their front steps on a Thursday evening applauding our fantastic workers, our essential workers, especially those who are working in health and social care. So I think it would be, you would need a crystal ball to be able to predict where our union or the state of our union and where it will be in 10 years' time. I obviously hope that it is as strong, if not possibly, hopefully stronger than it is right now. I think that the United Kingdom has a very bright future on the world stage. I think we'll get through this together, and I think we'll build bonds. I think one of the benefits of the past few weeks has been maybe a realization, not just of politicians, but actually of many in the media, that devolution actually exists, and that we can have divergent policies in Scotland, Edinburgh and Cardiff and Belfast and in London without it bringing the earth tumbling down around us. I think that's a positive sign, and I think we can build on that, do proper devolution, get real devolution to the cities and regions in England, make sure that decision makers are as close to people as possible. Maybe, as I said, see devolution within Scotland, Wales, in Northern Ireland down to lowest common denominator, and let's actually build a United Kingdom that's fit for the future. To turn to Sweden, my wife is Swedish, and I should have been in Stockholm. I should have been in Stockholm in 4 days' time. So thank you all very much for reminding me that I won't be, and I'll be, I'll still be here. And you know, we can look with awe. And there is a lot to learn from the Scandinavian example of how they run their country. But they are by no means, you know, a panacea. It's not a land of milk and honey. They have their issues as well. And in terms of what they offer and what Scotland would be able to offer in terms of moving forward, you know, there is no free healthcare for the elderly in Sweden. You have to pay to see the doctor, to stay overnight at a hospital, for example. And that's just the start of a long list of areas that, if we want to be as successful as these Scandinavian countries, an independent Scotland would have to seriously look at if we were to bring spending down to the level that we need.
More social democracy.
So that's in terms of where we're going to be in 10 years. I hope the union will be.
Can I just say, Mark, I got one of the predictions of the last year right. When the Swinson-Blackford letter spooked Corbyn into joining the bandwagon for the election, I did predict that Boris Johnson would have a thumping majority as a huge Christmas present, and unfortunately, I was right. The one I wouldn't go into the one consolation of that, but Andrew Bowie will know the arithmetic there.
Well, there you go. Angus, you're a rarity. A politician that makes predictions of things they don't want to happen. That's extremely rare for our politicians. Listen, we've run well over time. I'm very sorry to those of you who asked questions that we couldn't get in, but thank you very much for joining us. As all of our panel have stated, predicting the future is an extremely difficult thing to do, but I am going to make one prediction with absolute certainty. That is that there will be brilliant online digital content continuing to go up on the IEA London YouTube channel. So make sure you subscribe to that. If you're watching us on YouTube, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Also, to be invited to further webinars like this, make sure you go to our website, iea.org.uk. You can sign up there for our daily newsletter. And if you can help us financially in any way at all, however modest your donation, obviously the bigger the better, to help us to continue to produce these webinars and broadcast them to anyone who wants to watch, please do make a donation. You can also do that on the IEA website. Gentlemen, thank you all for your divergent but fascinating views. Andrew, Philip, Angus, it's been an absolute pleasure to host you. We look
Future Ambassador Bowie, I prefer.
Ambassador Bowie, it's been a great pleasure to have you. We look forward to inviting you back to the IEA soon. Thank you very much to all of our guests and those who asked questions. Have a great rest of your day. Stay safe. Over and out.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you.